Hi, I am Dr. Kirti Ranchod. I am a neurologist focusing on brain health. So, how do we keep the brain healthy to reduce the risk of certain illnesses? And how do we function well in the world? How do we enjoy the lives we are living so that we stay healthy and thrive and celebrate life? The focus of this series of talks is on what we have within our traditions and our cultures, our ways of living and being that support health. I am going to be joined today by author, poet, and academic Yirga Gelaw Woldeyes, who has in-depth knowledge on different Ethiopian cultural systems and philosophies and how this could lead to better health, better living, and healthier aging. With that, let me welcome Yirga and begin. Hi, Yirga. Thank you for joining me today. I'm very excited about the discussion we're going to be having on culture and health and perspectives on healthy aging.
Thank you so much for having me as well. I'm very pleased to chat with you, to talk to you.
I thought we could begin a little bit with a little bit about you and what you do, and maybe a little bit about the book you wrote, Native Colonialism, which has lots of important concepts as we approach aging, actually, or health.
Thank you. Well, I'm from Ethiopia. I grew up in a place called Lalibela. It's a beautiful place in Ethiopia where a king called Lalibela turned this massive rock as big as a village into churches built from that single rock.
Right.
So the churches were built from the roof and carved out,
Right.
and are still used as sacred places where especially the elderly would teach young people like myself about life, about wisdom. And some of the work I do reflect that thinking that I got from them. I feel like my upbringing and my intellectual pursuit as well here in universities, teaching and researching, is very much inspired by the ideas that I brought from home in Africa, and particularly from the elderly, which were my teachers, like especially a man called, an elder called Abba Zacharias, Abba Eskase, and all of these people, which are very wonderful, wonderful professors, unfortunately have gone away from us here. So my research focuses on thinking about culture, about education, about society, using the lens of the experiences of our people.
Right.
And also critiquing how using other people's lenses, especially Western theories, really harmed our culture and our relationship with each other and with our environment. And that encompasses a large set of problems that has to do with our way of thinking. I a lot think about cognitive justice and cognitive rights in that light, because our mind, when it is fed from the experience of our people, thinks differently than when it is immersed in other people's thought and ideas.
What do you mean by that, cognitive justice?
Well, what I mean by that, or generally, sometimes it's called epistemic justice or cognitive justice, it has to do with the relationship between knowledge and our way of being as human beings in Africa. You know, if we look at history, how the idea of the mind, for example, as something that has these cognitive properties emerged, of course, as a physical entity, the mind operates, but it's also mythologized or theorized in our theories and ideas, and we have a notion of the mind as a source of reality, especially in Western thought. So what happened, especially in the West and at the beginning of modernism, was the rise of this idea that the source of truth, the source of reality, is actually the human mind, that the world doesn't have any value, and value properties emerge from our mind, and we are the sources of truth, knowledge, and we give significance for everything in the world. And that type of story has a particular background. The Europeans had their own reason to think that way. If you think back in their history, religion have had a significant role in destroying people's relationship with each other in the environment. You can think of the Crusades, you can think of all kinds of issues around minorities, persecution of Jews and non-believers, and all of that, religious wars. So people were trying to kind of avoid anything, the existence of a being outside of the mind. And wanted to come back and say that, look, whatever we're thinking about through religion and so on is just our own construction. It's created by the mind, and the mind has to be reasonable, has to be trained, because it is a source of truth. But that type of understanding is the understanding of an alienated person, a person who lives in a world where that person's sense of being is separated, alienated from tradition, from the elders, the teachings of the past, and so on. That idea, unfortunately, is imposed on Africa, imposed on us through colonialism. In Ethiopia in particular, through Western education. And that involves a kind of cognitive violence or epistemic violence. Because we in Ethiopia or in Africa, we're not living in an alienated world. You can say anything bad about Africa or Ethiopia, whatever, but you cannot say that alienation was our problem. Because people had intimate relationship with each other, with nature, the lifestyle that they had. They believed that the world outside of them, the environment, the trees, the animals, and so on, have value properties that require us to act in a certain way in the world. So they can resolve conflicts, they do things, their mental, physical, the entire health was supported through that process because they were not alienated. So what happened in the last 50 years in Ethiopia, and also throughout colonialism, in particular in Africa as well, was to impose a worldview which says that whatever we have or had worth nothing, and we have to be educated, trained by the experience of other people, and imposing that upon ourselves. In my book called Native Colonialism, what I try to show is Ethiopia, a country that maintained its independence because of this unalienated relationship between people, with the elderly, with the sense of Ethiopia. This Ethiopia was subjected to a colonial type of education in the last 50 years. What we see today through violence, through various things in Ethiopia is the product of this last 50 years, especially because we destroyed the most sacred institution that kept peace in Ethiopia, which is the institution of the elderly. Because the older people are not regarded as burdens. They are regarded as sources of value, sources of truth, and sources of wisdom. They guide us, they teach us. But with the beginning with Marxism, socialism in the 1960s, the Ethiopian student movement and the current ethnic movement destroyed the fabric of this source of value and imposed upon us a struggle for power. Now, the only value is power, because value is taken away from the world outside of us, which is the trees, the other tribes, and so on. I can give you some examples of this as our discussion goes on. So sorry for the long rant, but what I'm trying to say, to tell you by cognitive violence or epistemic violence is very much intimated, is a lot of the time people say, well, Africa cannot blame the West because of knowledge, because they didn't have any knowledge. No, one of the serious violence against Africa was a violence based on knowledge. In Ethiopia, it involves physical taking of all sources of knowledge, the Giz manuscripts, like the bronzes in Mali, and other places were accumulated and taken away physically. And also an alien knowledge system was imposed on us so that we become our own enemy. And that is a search for cognitive justice is trying to kind of counter this imposition of knowledge.
Why do you think it's important? So in part, the work I'm doing is looking at how our cultures and traditions support health and support healthy aging. And so why do you think it's important? Because it's one knowledge system replacing another knowledge system. Is it important for us to try and change this?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, and people often assume or ask those questions, which is very important. But I think it is really important to ask the relationship between knowledge and reality.
Right.
The reality of life in Africa has its own narratives, its own wells of knowledge. The thoughts that we study in universities in the West emerged from the experience of the West. As the idea of the philosophy of the mind in Descartes' thought, for example. I think, therefore I am, he said, right? Because he, before saying that, he was doubting. Doubting was his methodology. How can I know that anything exists in the world? How can I know that I am talking to you right now? Because, what is my evidence? What is the proof? Doubting was his methodology. For us, the question is, do we need to ask this very question, who am I? Because a person who doubts is a person who lives in alienated world.
Right.
The world Descartes found himself, modernism found it, was a world where the medieval experience of Europe was so horrified that people want to break away from that tradition.
Right.
They were doubting everything. But we lived in a world where tradition gave rise to knowledge. And that knowledge helped us to live in the world, not against the world. So they wanted to control, but we wanted to live in harmony in Africa. So if we bring a knowledge not based on our people's experience, we make our people slaves of the knowledge of other people. Slavery changed from physical slavery into mental slavery. That's why people like Ngungi and others talk about decolonizing the mind, which is very, very important. And I'm happy to give you more examples about its importance in conflict resolution, for example. It's important in the philosophy of being, in social responsibilities, and so on.
Yeah, definitely. I'm keen to hear more of your examples, and in particular, how that separation or that colonization, mental colonization, then impacts on the way we live, and what are the long-term effects of it, either as an individual or in our communities.
Yeah.
Like, I think a lot of what I'm doing, like I say, is to promote health. But when I look at it, part of it has to address this issue, because I think it also affects our health, right? The way we live, the way we relate to each other, everything. So, yeah.
Absolutely. That's a very fascinating, because, even coming to a specific question of health itself, we had our own way of addressing health. Let me give you one concrete experience. Recently, when I went to Ethiopia about 2 years ago, I met with my grandmother.
Right.
She's around 100 plus years. We don't exactly know when she was born, but she's very old. And my uncle, who lived in a rural place, came to the town in Lalibela. And I was asking him the varieties of seed that they have in the countryside. And we're talking about the different varieties of barley seed. And when I asked him to tell me the varieties, my grandmother becomes so furious. Stop, don't tell him. And I was so surprised, because when I was young, she was so eager to tell me everything.
Right.
But now when I was trying to listen to the varieties of seed they have, she was so angry at him for telling me the varieties. Don't tell him. And I asked why. And she said, This is a very complicated philosophy, this taselluful, as kind of defense against tradition or against health. What it means is taselluful is a traditional way by which a kind of evil person would magically steal your property and take away the value that property has and use it for himself. It's usually believed as someone who has special training, in traditional knowledge. There are some certain sections of knowledge that are regarded as dangerous, like it's magical or something. So there are certain groups of people who would take away something from you without even you knowing it.
Right.
And she viewed me as a vehicle of that.
Wow.
If he tells me the details of the seed, I will somehow magically will steal it and take it away to the white people's country or something.
Right.
And later on, I asked her, why did you relate me with this evil deed? And she didn't tell me the details, but what I found out is that in Ethiopia, in her village, they had numerous varieties of seed in the past. But in recent times, the taste has changed dramatically. And the varieties has significantly reduced. The type of balanced diet, nutrition, taste, texture the food has gone.
Wow.
And the reason for that is in recent years, people like myself going to the villages started to preach and tell them that they need fertilizers, they need selected seed, and they must buy from companies that are bringing this. And people were literally forced to use fertilizers and seeds. And the problem with that is eventually their land started to be, they call it susanya, which means addicted to these foreign things.
Yeah.
And then eventually they are asked to pay more and more money to purchase the fertilizer. If they don't use the fertilizer, the land literally cannot grow the crops. And even if the land grows the crops, still the taste has changed. And the varieties of seed provided to them are foreign for them. So for her, she cannot research and say that why are these people applying the same type of fertilizers, the same type of seed everywhere, because they apply one or two types of fertilizers everywhere despite the variations in land, in climate, and so on. She cannot research that. But her traditional wisdom tells her that people, without you knowing it, even if you don't understand it, can magically steal something precious to you. And the only way to avoid that is to hide the knowledge from them. So she's forced into hiding that wisdom, that knowledge from her own grandson, because even me, without knowing it, would cause that harm to them. So, these traditions, without even us knowing them, are defense mechanisms, survival mechanisms by which our people try to maintain what they had from tradition.
Excellent. And I do think such a huge impact on health, like you're saying, just from a nutritional point of view, a knowledge point of view, and also how much sense it actually makes. And I think this is what you were referring to about cognitive justice. Like, somebody could have misinterpreted what your grandmother had said, and it would have sounded just superstitious, but it's not. It's based on knowledge, it's based on thought, it's based on trying to defend and protect, right?
Yeah.
Because I find a lot of concepts across the continent and globally in other regions that are not classified as Western, a lot of these concepts get misinterpreted and then manipulated against the people who actually use them. Yeah,
absolutely. There's ongoing research on this, because one of the likely challenges we're going to face is around these issues, because our indigenous wisdom and knowledge are destroyed. In some parts of East Africa where research has been done, for example, they found out that after this colonial plantation was taking place, people started to produce crops for export. And they started to depend on imported foods from overseas, processed foods. Recent incidents of disease shows you that non-communicable diseases has skyrocketed. In the past, these non-communicable medical diseases were very few in Africa because we somehow not depend on processed foods. Diabetes and hypertension, all these kind of things are quite significant now because of issues that are related to the destruction of traditional food habits, diverse ways of maintaining the environment and crops.
No, completely agree with you. I think that alienation from what we eat does cause a whole lot of problems, the hard medical illnesses like diabetes. But if you look at it also, so how your diet increases your risk of mental health issues, and how this particular diet that's high in saturated fat, high in sugar, not our traditional diets, increase your risk of mental health issues, increases your risk of dementia. So how do we sort of reinforce or rejuvenate our indigenous knowledge systems?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, and we also mentioned about mental health, which is a very important. One of the serious problem, which we even don't seem to have a way of describing and understanding, is what happens to people when their way of life is destroyed. What type of mental issues they face. Because our traditional rituals, practices, and values are intimately related with the environment. People, for example, perform rituals for the rain to come, perform rituals for the harvest. What happens when we take away their land from them and give it to an investor and they become landless in the name of growth or development? It's not simply that they are uprooted and land is taken away from them, but they are also subjected to a world where everything that they do in tradition does not make sense anymore, because they don't have a land to pray the rainfall, or they don't have those lives that they had in the past. Now, the cognitive justice issue that I talked about is something that takes away all of this, because it makes us think through the theory. Look what type of growth it's going to bring, how much GDP is going to increase as a result of that, and so on. And it's really interesting because the entire, as I said at the beginning, in Ethiopia in particular, the violence and the problems we see today is a result of violence against the elderly. And that is my view. Because in my understanding, in Ethiopia, the elderly are, or were at least, the sources of wisdom and knowledge. And you can think about that, especially in relation to mediating conflicts. How can a country that has 80 plus tribes lived without one tribe exterminating the other tribe? Not only that, without, of course, there were violence, but with having a method of resolving conflicts by themselves, with the capacity to come together and fight a modern European army and defeated that army and remained independent until now. What is the reason behind that? One of the main reasons is the knowledge and wisdom of the elderly, who told their children, go and die and fight for your country, who resolved conflicts. And I can give you concrete examples. For example, in a southern part of Ethiopia, there are groups of tribes, different tribes, who live side by side, but sometimes they engage in conflict. They had a traditional way of resolving that conflict. The ceremony is called bury the spear. These are tribes called Arbore, Borena, Hammer, Tsami, Konso, and so on. So what they do is these different tribes will come together and they have a way of talking to each other about what happened. and they physically destroy the spear, the mouth of the spear, which caused that violence. They kind of symbolize, personify the evil that caused people to die on the spear. They blunt the spear, they break it into pieces and throw it into the mound of ants and wash their hands, and then exchange gifts and bless each other, resolve their conflicts, and live peacefully. This traditional method of resolving conflicts existed for a very long period of time. Now, in Oromo culture, for example, we have a tradition called the Gada System. It's an age-based system. Starting from a young age, from birth to 8 years, for example, you become Dabale, where you are regarded as a free-spirited young person. And then eventually, age by age, every 8 years, your responsibility starts to increase. And then you reach at the age of 40 plus and join the Gada grade, where you'll have a chance to be responsible for different offices. And eventually, when you are old, after 80, you become what is known as Gada Moji, which means you become like a sacred person. So the older, unlike in the West, for example, where you are old, you'll be thrown into an institution and so on, older people are regarded as sacred people. In the northern part, where in the Amhara culture, for example, the body or the human person is believed to have 7 characteristics, 2 of the 3 belonging to the soul and 4 belonging to the body. So when you grow up as a person, you are born with 3 characteristics of the soul, which includes nabawinnet, hiyawinnet, and lebbawinnet, which means lebbawinnet means the ability to think, to reflect, to have knowledge. That is a property of your soul. The second property is speaking, language. Language is a property of your soul. Immortality is a property of the soul. Because of this, you conceptualize yourself as having these properties in your soul. Of course, taking away your knowledge is partly injuring your soul. Taking away your education, imposing other people's, and so on. And the body represents 4 forces in nature. From birth to the younger age, like the Dabale in Oromo, and the younger age in Amhara, for example, you grow up as a young person represented by wind. Nafas. Wind is characterized as free-spirited, a young person. So everything you do is tolerated. Nobody, unlike in some places where I go here, nobody ever tries to control a child, because a child's destiny is to be free, because there is that free spirit in the child. And then when you become like 20 or years old and so on, after teenage years, and then you start to be considered as fire. The fire stage, the society treats you as someone who is young, who can make mistakes, who have the energy to fight, you be trained, and so on. And then when you reach around 40 years old, you enter into the stage of water. Water is regarded as something that calms, that reconciles, that can extinguish fire. So if an elderly comes and sees young people fighting, automatically the young people will submit to the authority of the older person, and that person has the power to resolve their conflict, no matter what conflict they may have. And when you reach at the last stage, you become soil. Then that means you will return to die, and death, of course, is not the end of life. So all of this way of conceptualizing ourselves, the human being, is totally erased from our education system. And so in the new system, when a young person grows up, they don't really see value in the world other than from the textbooks that they learn. And what the textbooks they learn, or the information that they get from that, nurtures their mind, of course, and the mind is a source of truth. But ultimately, that knowledge is connected with power. You know, people say knowledge is power. But knowledge is not power in a traditional sense. Power submits itself to values in society, to the elders, for example. You don't live in the world to accumulate power. You live in the world to be humble. So there is this philosophy of Tehtenna. Tehtenna is like humbleness or humility. If you read most of the texts, the texts in Ethiopia, the first thing the writer does is actually to erase himself or herself. There's about 1 million books written by Ethiopians, most of which are stolen in the country, entirely dismissed by the government and the modern system, thrown out of the education system. Nobody in Ethiopia studies them. And in that book, you don't find the name of the authors. Because for them, knowledge is not the property of an individual. It's a gift, it's a common that has to be shared among everybody. But in the modern world today, knowledge is patented. We cannot manufacture medicine, even after many Africans participated for the development of some of these COVID vaccines. We are having problem to produce this because the companies are the owners, the patent owners of this knowledge. You see, so the destruction of the mind, these traditions has a serious consequence, really. And coming to your other question of how we may be able to kind of try to get back is also very important, but I want to give you a chance. Sorry, I'm talking too much.
No, it's fine. You've said so much, actually. I'm keen to go to that question, and I have other questions after that, given what you've said about ritual and education. But let's go as to how we can potentially shift this, even for people like me and the work I'm doing in health, that many people may look at as being different, but it's not. It's not separate, right?
Absolutely.
From everything we're discussing. And so, yes, because in a way, we're going to perpetuate that same violence if we don't consider these and consider how to actually transform the spaces we're working and transform our thought. So
absolutely.
Very difficult questions, but I'll leave it up to you to answer.
Absolutely. You see, one of the ways to think about it is to define, to really rethink the meaning of health. You know, because I think, in my view, we understand health as atomized individuals. What, as an individual, my body, because our understanding of health is very much related to the body. So everything about Africa is the body. What is the body going through and what's happening to bodies and so on. But our people understand health as a relationship, spiritually, culturally, socially, mentally, emotionally, morally, in all kinds of things. If the person is not in a good relationship with each other and the world, that person cannot be healthy. So one way of thinking about health is not to think about health in terms of an individualist lens where the individual's body has to be healthy. And in order to be healthy, must be supported by often Western medicine. But instead to see health as a health of community, as a health of relationships, as a way of living in harmony. And I give you one philosophical background to back up this. In Ethiopia, there is a woman, a sage woman, and she's regarded as saint as well, called Christos Samra. And one of her deeds was to really eliminate evil and to reconcile the two sources. The one, the source of evil, another, the source of good. The source of good is God. The source of evil is Satan in her understanding. But there is a third space between the two. That is very critical. Now, just to contrast this thinking with Western thought, for example, we have this understanding of dualism in the West, where reality is the composite of two opposite forces. self and other, mind and body, evil and good, in different literature. The contrast is always dualistic. The relationship is always confrontation. One must destroy the other, the civilized, the uncivilized. So in this Western way of framing reality as opposite, but at the same time siding to the one which is closer to oneself, because the self must win the other, the civilized must be win the uncivilized, the God must win and defeat and destroy the evil. In this relationship, there is no mediation. There is no reconciliation. You have to win. And the ultimate purpose of knowledge and everything is to accumulate power so that you destroy, conquer, control the other, the source of evil. But in the thinking of Christos Samra, this is entirely different. For her, what is powerful, what is important is the middle space, the mediator. So in that cosmology, in that thinking, reality has three dimensions. Two opposites, but there is a third space where reconciliation is possible. And the purpose of knowledge, the purpose of studies, the purpose of whatever power you get is to bring these sources into the middle ground. So we have so many saints, angels, or good people, elders, especially elders are regarded as mediators, people who bring reconciliation. It's called Irk. Irk is critical for the survival of societies, a healthy society in traditional societies. So what she tried to do is, okay, I want to reconcile God and the devil, and I want to do it in a spiritual way. And she dedicated her life for 12 years praying to God, asking him, you must reconcile with the devil. And he eventually agreed with her. And of course, the devil refused. The reconciliation didn't end. But in this text, which is an old medieval text, it states how she conceptualized, how it shows you how it is possible to believe and accept that there is another space where society's values are situated. That space is reconciliation and Irk, which is being destroyed by this modern conception of power. Now, all people still exist. We see in Africa, we hear about violence and conflicts, but millions of people live. In Ethiopia, 100-something million people. Not everybody is fighting against everybody, of course. But the leaders, the people like myself, who are not willing to learn anything from tradition, who view everything with a very narrow mindset, are, I think, the sources of a lot of the problem. If we are willing to learn and change our attitude and start to understand what is really important in our tradition, how do people live, and think the world through their eyes, through their experience, we can do a lot better than we are doing now.
Yeah, we do think of the world in terms of like right or wrong. And I think even this is an internal problem, right? Like we often need to even internally find this middle ground, the space for, as opposed to thinking something we did is right or wrong, or thoughts are right or wrong. Where do we find that symmetry in the middle?
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's very, very important. That's why because these conceptions of the self are after all conceptions. It's in our mind that we create these images because the mind can duplicate itself. I can imagine myself in the space of God and imagine that, okay, what is happening in the world? A lot of this is mental constructions. So we can reflect on and think, because when I say I know myself, let me try to know myself. Okay, so when I try to say that and to search for meaning within myself, the person who is searching meaning is a person who is lost. Like the lost person is looking for, or who is doing the finding is a person who is lost himself. That there's this understanding because we are unable to relate with anything outside of the individual. if I am not able to relate with the world outside of me because the values that hold us together are no more there, which is why, for example, we are unable to solve conflicts in Ethiopia today. In recent conflicts, people were trying to mediate, but the leaders were unable to come to the table, because for them, the middle ground that tradition has built is not important. So even within us, we can create that middle ground by drawing it from our tradition and find a space to reconcile ourselves with.
What comes through very strongly in terms of this discussion is the impact of what we will call modern education system, which is pervasive now globally, right? So you can relate it in Ethiopia, but I can see it having been my education and the education system that still happens. And how that education system then alienates us from our traditions and our cultures. Like you described such an important ritual, burning of the spear, where it's philosophical but practical and physical, so that it becomes tangible in terms of resolving the conflict, right? Whereas our education system has made, again, everything that's ritualistic, primitive, or I don't even think primitive is a bad word, but do you know what I'm saying? They've minimized the importance of ritual and of tradition in our societies. And I see that happening in my community and more broadly.
I think that's a very important question, which we always, many people always ask. And there's this important point to remember, because when you think about tradition or rituals, it's not about repeating everything our ancestors were doing. If we think rituals as something that was done in the remote past without any change, we think them through the Western lens, which views traditions as static, stuck in past. They are not dynamic. They cannot transform or change with the world. Our traditions, our cultures are stuck, not because they are static naturally, but because they are victimized epistemically. That's what I told you about epistemic violence. We don't allow people who have that wisdom to teach the young. We don't allow Ethiopian Giz manuscripts to become part of our textbooks in schools. We don't allow people who go through the traditional system for 30 plus years, meditating on different texts, which is relevant, by the way, to the actual life that people are living, to become part of our discourse, to become part of our research. And I give you a concrete example in Ethiopia. Can you imagine in a country where I can guess more than 90 to 99% of the population do not understand English? The leaders decided that Ethiopian students in high school and university must study English. When I go to the law school in Ethiopia, Ethiopians, lawmakers legislate law in Amharic or in the local language in different regions. The country, it has its own calendar. 8 years back now, it's different from everything's different. Now, but when I go to university, although the laws are written in the local language, the country's language, our teachers taught us in English. That is not their first language even. Why would they teach us in English when the people don't understand English? When we go out to practice law, we're not going to use that language. Because of this mental slavery that I'm talking about. You see, why we think our traditions are stuck is because mentally we are immersed in a Western epistemology that makes us feel or believe that our people are stuck in the past. Because these rituals do not exist by themselves like a mineral. They are part of how the people do things, right? So when we go and incorporate them into our system, into our thinking of health, what is a healthy society mean? What is a healthy child upbringing mean? We make what exists in the society's lived experience today part of our thinking now. And of course, the rituals in the past can give us some intellectual roots to reflect on them, where they come from and so on. They become real references than other textbooks. Not only the past, the remote past, we can even bring from Western ideas. You see, the problem is, where do we start? We start from the alienated Western knowledge and make our tradition, our people's experience, just mere data. You know, the theory is Western theory. We collect data from our people as raw material. We use them to implement and test whether the theory works or not. We serve a theory that did not emerge from the questions, the problems, the struggles of our people. That's why we serve this mental, we were in this mental slavery, where in the past our ancestors were physically enslaved, now we are mentally enslaved, but we don't even know it. So that is why these movements of decolonization, sometimes they are misinterpreted and misused, could be useful, because decolonization is not just smashing everything in the past, it's actually changing our orientation and allowing people who were denied the spaces in universities, in policy-making circles, in research, to narrate, to educate, and so to become part of the conversation.
Yeah, no, I think so too. I think also there's this idea, like you said, that our traditions don't progress, don't modernize, but they do, because nothing is static. We go back to what you were saying about the elders in your community and in Ethiopia as a whole. And again, I think it's something that is common in many different spaces across the African continent and Asia, Latin America, particularly in traditional societies, where people, as they get older, still have value, still have respect, still have responsibility. And I think that, like you mentioned, there's something about the language that is wrong, right? Like, people are looked at as burden as opposed to value. And it's looked at as, again, burden as opposed to responsibility. What do I need to do to make sure everybody is included in my society? And so then people who are vulnerable related to age or other issues are pushed out of the society as a whole, which is never going to be a healthy society.
Absolutely.
And it is a big problem in specific parts of the world, and is becoming a bigger problem in our part of the world. What do we need to do, understanding, again, our culture and our traditions, to make sure this doesn't happen, that we don't have a system where older people are just put in an institution?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is very critical, because the more we go down this path where the values in our society are meaningless to us, we become very cruel type of societies. Cruelty is a very serious issue, because, you know, after all, when we view the older person as a burden, we take away everything that values and tradition give that person from him. We take away the respect that culture give him. Actually, in our traditions, even after people died, their spirit live with us. Not just in Eastern traditions. You can look at Japanese tradition, for example. The relationship between the living and the dead, the living under the perpetual gaze of the dead, actually orients what they do and how they relate with the environment in indigenous cultures, for example. So if we do that, if we see the older person as burden, we take away all that values from that person. One day we will become old as well. That means we dehumanize ourselves at the same time. You know, when we look at our environment, we take away all the values people ascribe to them, whether we believe it or not, the values they give for the trees, the spirit associated with the rivers and the rituals, because that thing keeps them together, makes them healthy, understand the world and give meaning to their life. If we think that only as a resource that should be converted into cash, we destroy the environment. We also destroy the world. So this mindset is a cause of massive, massive disease, massive infection that really turns us into a kind of monsters. There's a very interesting way where Ami Siddhar talks about the colonizers or the civilizers. One of the things that is profound was that colonialism de-civilized the civilizer. It means like when you go out and mistreat people as savages, as primitives, and you want to enforce order on them. In the eyes of those people, you are a monster. You are not a human, although you don't know it. But what also happened after colonialism is, there are studies which show that when Europeans returned to their own places and saw these all cultures as savages backwards, because they are emotional, they have rituals, they are dancing and so on, they started to enforce order in their own society, to discipline especially women and children. The kind of control of men over women, over the disciplining of children, corporal punishment in Western societies has a lot to do with this mental colonial mindset, which made people cruel and impose on other people certain principles that must be followed, because for them, those ideas are more important than the human person. So I think it is really important to think in terms of what type of person am I going to be? How are my children going to see me tomorrow? Because what you are doing to your older grandmother or grandfather today is what your grandchildren will do to you tomorrow. It could be even worse if you don't show them doing what is based in our tradition, which is caring for the other person, than throwing them to institutions.
You've given me so much to reflect on, actually. And just in terms of what you say, in terms of that imposition, it's so prevalent in the health system. This is one of the challenges going forward. It is the way largely the health system that I come from would work. You know, there's an imposition of an idea of a best way, best practice. And yeah, you've given me a lot to reflect on that I'm going to have to think about going forward as well. So thank you for that. You've given me again so much information and so much that I'm curious about and that I would want to learn more, and I'm hoping my viewers would want to learn more. What would you recommend as a starting point to understand a little bit more about Ethiopian philosophical systems or health systems? What would you recommend I read, or which authors?
Yeah.
Or, besides your book, Native Colonialism, which sounds fascinating.
Yeah. My book, that's a very good question, because very tragic things are unfortunately happening in Ethiopia. It's something everybody's hearing and listening today. Just a few days ago, young, small children were brutally murdered sometime in a western part of the country, in Oromia. And they were killed because the murderers view them in a particular ethnic lens. They call them, they're settlers or Amara or so on. But what is really remarkable about the type of violence that's perpetuated on particular groups of people, there were violence against the elderly as well, that this is massively shocking for any Ethiopian who lived in that tradition, that great country. And the sexual violence that we hear about is something unheard of in our history. And I think what makes me reflect is something that is missing in the conversation, which is genocide against culture. That is what's happening in Africa. That's what's happening in Ethiopia. If you see a lot of the violence in Africa, it doesn't show you a culture of violence, which some people portray it to be. In Western literature, always, we are seen as mad people who bend toward harming each other. And they haven't had an idea to change or to engage with the country's tradition in the past. Ethiopia, as a great nation, still holds the great cultural resource most Africans lost through colonialism. You see, still the manuscripts, still the culture is intact. Unfortunately, the modern literature, which is, by the way, controlled by Western scholars, which are using Ethiopian manuscripts to advance their own agenda and allowing Ethiopians to use them. They read only texts from them. And the diaspora, other Africans who heard great things about Ethiopia, are unable to reach them because of this linguistic barrier created by outsiders. That Ethiopians who write using their own scripts, their languages and ideas, cannot reach to other African or other brothers and sisters because the knowledge system is colonized. And as a result of that, we are engaged in a kind of cultural genocide in Ethiopia, where the worst form of genocide is when people go out and kill, the murderers become murdered as well. Because you cannot become a sane, healthy person in society after killing innocent people. And this is tragic. This is a consequence of a colonial enterprise that happened in the last 50 years. It is not because our tradition, culture, and all of those great things Ethiopia had become like this. It is a violence against everything Ethiopia kept for 2,000 years of, or more, or 10,000 years of its history, if you read back from ancient times as well.
Yeah, and I think, again, what you've shown us is how everything is linked to this process of colonization, the cultural genocide, mental colonization, how it affects what we eat, gives us our illness, how it destroys our social structures where we do value wisdom, particularly in our elders, and how it changes the way we would respond to conflict in different levels. And so now you're having this conflict in Ethiopia and other parts of the continent and the world that are actually all linked to the same root, actually.
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. And so the unfortunate thing also is all of this conflict is done ultimately for a future that is not ours. You see, all of the violence that's happening in Africa, people think it is because of past history and grievances and so on. It's actually violence. It's actually a fight for the present and the future. Because the past history is full of all kinds of things. There is violent incident. Some people say history is a war against the future. Why? Because history is constructed by selecting stories of war. We don't study how people live and loved each other. We don't have detailed narratives of how people were really celebrating together, what type of romantic relationship they had, what type of songs they sang, what type of laughter they had. We have details of how one person mutilated another person, how they destroyed the villages, what type of horrendous things they did to each other. This is ideology, because this type of history is a war against the future. So that our mindset, our expectation of the present and the future will be like war. Media or the film industry is also part of that. And there is an industry that benefits by disabling us from relating with each other in the world in a good way, from bringing out good things in the world. Because if we are fearful of each other, fight against each other, we cannot use our resources, we cannot develop our life or change our future. We become at the mercy of anyone who has power. And this is part of the mental slavery matrix that has been imposed on us. And as an Africans, we have to really reflect on that. And we may not be able to change everything, but we can change ourselves. We can change in conversation with each other, as you said earlier, by finding that middle peaceful space. by finding important things, things that are more important than us, than the self, to live for, and so on. And also by focusing on relationships than on individuals. What we forget is, what constitutes life is how things are related with one another, with each other. If our focus is on that, than on how everything is separated from one another, but instead how everything is related to one another, the things that we generate from everything we had will be something positive.
Thank you, Yirga. I think that's a good note to end on, that we need to focus actually on our relationships internally with others, but also with our environment. I think you mentioned it quite a bit in terms of the trees and plants and nature. But that really is what will lead us to better health and really the lives that we can enjoy living, which I think is key. It's not about health really, it's about us celebrating the life we have.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's very important and true. Thank you for having me, and I really hope this type of conversations happen more frequently in the continent, and we be able to form communities and start to heal ourselves, our places, our environments, and also listen to our elders. Their experiences are very important. And it's also a source of great spiritual blessing, because we will be very miserable when we become old. Age is beautiful. The beauty about age, and there is an age system in Ethiopia, as I mentioned, the Gada system, or the of the Oromo, for example. That's a beautiful system, which means that we all pass through that privilege. If we break it somewhere, we also face the consequences. So it is really important to hear to that tradition, and thank you for having me, really.
Thank you. Thank you, Yirga, for that wonderful, wonderful discussion. Thank you for your insights and for sharing your knowledge. It really has been a privilege. You've given me a lot to think about and to reflect on, particularly in the work that I'm doing. So again, thank you for that. I would highly recommend Yirga's book, Native Colonialism, to understand the impact of cultural colonization, a cultural genocide that is still happening on the African continent and in many, many parts of the world, affecting many people, affecting our health, affecting our ways of living. So I'd highly recommend it. And I hope you enjoyed this discussion as much as I have. And I hope to see you at the next one.